Good evening, everybody. I'm Rachel Bronson. I'm the Vice President of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. I am delighted by this turnout today, and I think it's a real testament to our speakers today, as well as the report that they've put out and signed. If you haven't seen it, there are copies out front, and it's well worth your read. It is my duty to ask you to go ahead and turn off your phones, please. They do interfere with our AV system, so if you can turn them off, that would be terrific. I want to also highlight for you 2 upcoming programs that you might be interested in based on your attendance here tonight. On October 29th, we have Roger Cohen from the New York Times, who will be speaking to us. And then on December 3rd, so flip your calendars or move your Blackberries that far ahead and then turn them off. We have Karen Elliott House from the Wall Street Journal talking on Saudi Arabia and the region. And again, both of those are well worth attending. For tonight's program, of course, we want to thank our supporters, and nobody has been a stronger supporter of these kinds of events for us than the Robert R. McCormick Foundation and their generous support for council programming. We're greatly appreciative. And again, I mentioned that the report is out front. We also have out front the speakers here today penned an op-ed that appeared in the Chicago Tribune about a week ago. And if you didn't get a chance to see that, that's out there. And of course, the Chicago Council survey, which you've been hearing a lot about. If you haven't yet taken a copy, they're out there and is well worth your read. So with that, I am actually quite delighted to be able to welcome and introduce you to the chairman of our organization, who will introduce the panel, Mr. Lester Crown.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everybody. You're really in for a treat tonight, and I think you know that that's the reason the size of the audience that came this evening. We're really very pleased to welcome you to this particular presentation, which is part of the Council's Middle East Forum series. And this has been an ongoing series that provides coverage and dialogue on what's really a very important region. We're extremely fortunate tonight to have with us 3 very knowledgeable and really knowledgeable experts on the region. And they have been involved, ladies and gentlemen, in a project that I think is going to surprise almost everyone in this room. I know that it surprised me because I had never heard of it before. But it's called the Iran Project. It's existed for nearly a decade, and with the intention of addressing the strategic issues that separates the United States and Iran, and supposedly trying to reduce misunderstandings between the 2 countries through a Track 2 dialogue. The dialogue has actually involved U.S. foreign policy officials and experts and a group of senior Iranian academics and policymakers. Frankly, I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear what they have to say about the report. Dr. Rachel Bronson will lead the conversation this evening, and later she'll field the questions from all of you as part of our usual Q&A session. You've received the official biographies of our guests at your seat, and in the interest of time, I'm really going to very briefly introduce them to you before we begin the discussion. First, Ambassador Thomas Pickering, who presently serves as Vice Chairman of Hills & Company. He holds the rank of Career Ambassador, which is the highest rank in the U.S. Foreign Service. He's had an absolutely distinguished career that has spanned 5 decades, and it's include ambassadorial postings in Israel, Jordan, Russia, and the United Nations, among others. And I've had the personal pleasure and privilege of working with and meeting with Tom over the years and even traveling with him with the Gulf, and it's just a pleasure to have him here in Chicago. Second, Dr. Jim Walsh, who's an expert on nuclear weapons and terrorism. He's a research assistant at Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Security Studies Program. Third panelist is General Anthony Zinni, who's a retired 4-star general in the United States Marines. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but if you have had anything to do with the military all your life, I want to know how many have met a 4-star Marine general before. I've met very few. General Zinni was really very highly regarded in the region during his tenure when he was chief of the United States Central Command. And upon retirement, he served as President Bush's special envoy to Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Rachel Bronson is the Vice President of Studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Previous to that, she directed the Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York before we kidnapped her and brought her to Chicago. So I think you're in for a treat tonight, so join me in welcoming our whole panel to Chicago.
Well, terrific. I'd like to open up the discussion by spending some time on the report itself to make sure that all of us are kind of on the same page with you. I'm going to turn the first question, Tom, to you. But for those of you who haven't yet seen the report, it is signed or endorsed by kind of the who's who of foreign policy. Dick Armitage, Paul Volcker, Les Gelb, Anne-Marie Slaughter, bipartisan, very important people. So what they have to say is really crucial. And so, Ambassador, what I might open up with you is in the beginning of the report, the authors lay out what a difficult and challenging problem the kind of U.S.-Iran relations with Iran's nuclear weapons program is, that this is one of the most difficult challenges to U.S. foreign policy. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about that in general. And I think, Jim, I'm going to turn that same question to you on the nuclear issues, and General, I'm going to turn to you on the military planning. But, you know, Ambassador, from your kind of vantage point of Washington, D.C., why is this so dangerous and challenging for us?
Let me just begin, Rachel, by first saying how pleased I am to be here and to join Jim and Tony in the panel tonight. And thank you, Lester and Marshal Bhutan, very much for having us. The report itself is a fascinating report, and I'll just say two things about the report and then go to your question. It's the only report I've ever known in Washington that makes no recommendations. It specifically is designed to have you make your own recommendations. And it also has no conclusions, or it has one conclusion, that an informed debate about this critical issue is in the interest of the United States, and we have tried in the report to do our best to provide our best judgment of the facts that underlie the choice here and weighed the costs and the benefits for you in a position to allow you, in effect, to make your own judgment. Why this is important, of course, is beyond the nuclear question, which Jim will address. There is a preoccupation about Iran. Iran is perhaps the largest and potentially the most powerful country in the region. It has real aspirations in the region to be looked at, if not as a hegemon, at least as a country which is going to show and make its own weight. It is a country with 2,500 years of history, a poetical and remarkable language, a culture that goes deep into the heart of almost every Iranian, and a country which we have been estranged from since the end of 1978. Our relationship with Iran is zip. It is one that is characterized by mistrust, informed by an increasing cycle of misunderstanding, and the two work together and create what is almost the perfect downward spiral. Not only the Iranian geostrategic and geopolitical position is important, it is one of the major producers of oil, and oil still remains, despite our success with shale gas, a critical commodity in the world's energy and economic relationship. The nuclear question raises hackles because there is deep concern And I hasten to add, the report makes clear that the U.S. intelligence community judgment, supported in my view by Israel, is that Iran has not yet decided to make a nuclear weapon, although we believe it has decided to equip itself with the technology and the expertise to move there. But if it were to move in that direction, it would be massively destabilizing. It would, in my view, lead Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, and perhaps the UAE in the same direction. It would undermine seriously our non-proliferation policy, which is based on the notion that the more people who have it, the more likely you are to have a chance of accidental miscalculation, misjudgment in use, if not plain cussedness in a situation where people feel themselves in difficulty, and that has been a centerpiece of our policy since the 1960s, and it's very important. So that's the panoply of relations: political, geostrategic, economic, nuclear.
We're going to come back to all of those, as you can imagine. Jim, let me just get some on the table. Your focus has been on the nuclear issues, and this report, many commented, was probably on nuclear issues one of the most important primers that's been put out, and I'm sure that has a lot to do with your good work. But maybe you can, we hear a lot about the nuclear issue, of course, and I think everybody in this room knows that's a key component, but maybe you can talk through and provide a little depth of why is this so dangerous right now?
Well, first of all, I want to start by saying it's great to be in Chicago. I don't get to get here as often as I would like, but it's a fun place, and I'm happy to be here. And I'm even happier to be here before this particular audience in the council. You know, I travel a lot of places. I've been to North Korea. I've been to Iran. They don't have councils in North Korea and Iran. So there may be some possibility, entrepreneurial possibility there. But I've been to a number of them in the U.S., and there's a second none to this. I mean, there's obviously competition, but Chicago's work is, and the work of all of you, is well known, well respected, and it's really an honor for me to be here. Let me say about Iran's nuclear program and put it in a little context. I know people hear nuclear and immediately, you know, the mind begins to spin and it's all doom and gloom and horror. But I want to step back for a second and look at the record that we've had with respect to nuclear proliferation. The shocking story here is that in the 20th century, the rate of nuclear proliferation declined over time. The number of new nuclear weapon states per decade declined over time. We had 3 nuclear weapon states in the 60s, 2 in the 70s, and down the number went. We had predictions that nuclear weapons would spread. We would have 20 or 30 nuclear weapon states. It didn't happen. In fact, we had a lot of countries that started down the path towards nuclear weapons. Some 30 countries that started down the path towards nuclear weapons stopped and reversed course. So this is a good news story. The big picture is a good news story. We've had tremendous success. I used to say that the success we've had with preventing the spread of nuclear weapons is on par for the 20th century with abolishing slavery before, in a previous century, that this is poses a direct threat to humanity, not to countries, but to humanity. And somehow we've managed to pull back and have success. So that's the context, right? It's not perfect. You know, North Korea has a weapon. There are other nuclear weapon states. But the horrible future that everyone predicted didn't come true, and we've made some tremendous progress. Now, as we look forward, we're looking forward to a century in which international relations is changing. You have the rise of China in Asia. You have a more combustible Middle East, and a point in which the US and the Soviet Union are no longer dominant. So you have a changing of the guard at a time when there's instability. And then you have the possibility of nuclear weapons. And so we've achieved so much, but if we hope to achieve more with reducing our own stockpiles here at home, with getting countries to cap their programs, in some cases to roll back their programs, then that's going to be very hard to do in a context in which Iran were to acquire a nuclear weapon, or in which others might be motivated to start down that path, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, perhaps. I think proliferation chains are weak. That's a technical discussion to have later. But it's certainly true that it at least puts that issue on the table. If you're in the government and you're sitting around the table in Cairo or elsewhere, and Iran comes out and publicly has a nuclear weapon, well, you're going to stop and think about it. It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but you're going to stop and think about it when before, you know, that would not have been a meeting. So I think it is dangerous. It's dangerous politically, and it's dangerous for the future of the nonproliferation regime, for the future of U.S. policy. And who's a target, who's a potential target at the end of the day in a world of proliferated states, states that may have leakage in which nuclear weapons pass to non-state actors? No, it's the U.S. So I think I take this very seriously, and I've devoted my career to try to stop and roll back the spread of nuclear weapons. But we are not there yet, and I want to emphasize the point that Tom has made. It is the finding of the top officer of the U.S. intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence. And you don't hear this in any debates or any campaign commercials. But this is the person who oversees all 16 U.S. intelligence agencies. And he testifies every year before the Congress and issues a public report. Not all of it's public, but a public report. And what does he say? I wrote it down, but I'll just paraphrase it. He says, Iran already has some capacity. I mean, they know how to build a centrifuge. You can't bomb the knowledge of the centrifuge, how to build a centrifuge, out of their heads. They have some basic capacity that they have acquired over a 10-year period. But they have not yet made the decision to go down that path. And that may sound like quibbling to all of you. What's the difference between a capability decision and a bomb decision? Isn't it all the same thing? No, it is not the same thing. Historically, the countries that started down the path towards nuclear weapons and acquired them were the countries who made that decision. They said, I want a bomb, I want it now, we're going to get it done. And that group that I told you about before that started down that path and fell away, they were a group that said, yeah, we would sort of like to have that, that would be nice. And then things happened. Leadership changes, wars, earthquakes, they got pulled aside. So we're in a situation right now where Iran has not yet made that decision, and the U.S. intelligence community has come to that finding with high confidence. So the game is before us. This is not a done deal. It's not doom and gloom is inevitable. It's not the worst will happen. We have a period now where we can point this in another direction. Historically, that's what the data says, and it's what our intelligence community believes. And so the question is whether we can find a path to begin to talk to the Iranians and find a way through a variety of mechanisms and instruments to put this on a different road so that we don't end up in a place we don't want to be. So I'll just summarize it there.
Thank you, and we'll come back, I promise, to this difference between kind of enrichment and weaponization, which you spent, which was very well articulated in the report. General, you have sat at the head of Central Command where you've had to think about a military engagement with Iran. And I know for military planners, that keeps them up at night, even the ideas of little boats kind of crashing into our ships. It's a very dangerous place. How are your counterparts thinking about the military threat from Iran? Is it mostly preventing them from going nuclear? Is it their presence in the region? I know it's all of them, but if you were kind of back there, sitting there thinking about Iran, how would you kind of prioritize your thinking and planning vis-a-vis Iran?
Okay. Well, thank you, Rachel. And first of all, let me echo what my colleague said. I've been out to Chicago several times and always addressed very informed audiences. And we were talking before we stepped up here, wondering how Chicago seems to have this great interest in foreign policy that we don't see anywhere else. We ought to transfer you to Washington. You know? Let me just step back a little bit from that and lead up to it. The commander of the U.S. Central Command has several missions or tasks he has to perform, and none of them would surprise you. One, he has to ensure the free flow of energy from that region. That energy fuels the economy, the global economy. Secondly, he has to ensure freedom of navigation and access to the region. And thirdly, he has to try to maintain and gain, in some cases, stability in the region through building partnerships, through protecting our allies, military-to-military relationships, working with our diplomatic colleagues and trying to generate a more stable environment in a place that's naturally unstable almost, it seems. Occasionally, I just talked to General Mattis, who's the current commander of CENTCOM. He's a good friend of mine, was one of my proteges. I think he thinks I cursed him and he inherited the job. But this is a crisis area of responsibility, crisis prone. And he has everything from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Iran, and I could go on and on. Many of the things that don't even make it to the top of the fold in the paper that he deals with day in and day out. And they all require a different approach. In addition to that, like all combatant commands, we break up the world into combatant commands, regional commands, the Pacific, the European Command, Southern Command, et cetera. We have deliberate plans, war plans, that we are required to maintain. And you could imagine, where those would lead us. And when we look at Iran in terms of a potential conflict, beside the day-to-day things that Rachel mentioned and how we've had an ongoing Cold War atmosphere out there that occasionally gets a little bit heated by ship bumpings and hostile bridge-to-bridge communication, we have to be prepared to take action if necessary. So as we've heard from both candidates, that there is a red line. And obviously there's arguments about where the red line is. All I would say as a military officer, let me in on it when you decide so I know what's going on. But our job is if the president says do it, you do it. And what do you have to concern yourself about if you're the commander of U.S. Central Command? Well, let me give you several, and this will not be, time doesn't allow for us to get into all of them. Iran has a very robust missile system, the Shahab series. Shahab 3 working on 4th generation. The 3s can reach Israel, the 4th can reach Western Europe. They're very mobile, so they're hard to target in many cases. They have fast patrol boats, alluded to by Rachel. And they've even gained more recently and higher speeds. Fast patrol boats with cruise missiles, difficult to pick up on radar, hard to deal with. They have a capability of mining the Strait of Hormuz. They have mines on dhows, on these fast patrol boats. If you don't get them all before they get out, and you have mines in the water, you can imagine what that does. Not only in a military sense, but should they hit a Saudi oil tanker, you can imagine what's going to happen to the price of oil, and you could imagine what that'll do to a very fragile global economy. It'll ricochet back on us. And it goes back to one of the tasks I said that we had. If you go back to the 80s when we had to reflag the tankers and protect them from, during the Iraq-Iran war, protect them in their ability to get out and distribute the energy resources from the region. They also have a very active intelligence service. And we know they have sleeper cells around the world. And those, we could assume they would activate, not only in the region, but maybe even globally. So this isn't an easy task. I think eventually, we would prevail, but I would not want anyone to think this is going to be, as we've heard before from stupid people, a cakewalk, a liberation, flowers in the street. We should not replay that. I mean, the reason I signed up on this when Tom, first of all, is bigger than I am, and when he said I would sign up, I signed up. But we have had enough of political leaders fairy dusting our going to war. Everything you've heard about this talks about military action, military strikes. Strike that from the dialogue. We're going to war. And to get to your question specifically, what I told General Mattis, you can't plan against assumptions. A good military commander plans against capabilities. I take all those capabilities that Iran might have, and I have to assume that they will use them all. And I have to build a plan that counters all them. We did that for Iraq, and the plan was thrown away, and we ended up with the problems we had. Same thing with Afghanistan. Same thing with Vietnam, if you think about it. We cannot walk into a situation like this fully appreciating what it would take. The American people have to understand that. The political leaders have to understand that. Most importantly, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines on the ground need to understand that and know what they're getting into, have the support and the commitment to that plan. So that's what we're going to face. There are intangibles and unknowns here. How will the region react to this? When we think about this, we think, well, they'll attack Israel or they'll attack American targets out there. They have said, Ahmadinejad has traveled across that Gulf, and the friends I have on the other side have told me, he's given veiled threats that should something happen, as our allies who allow us to use their bases, they're at risk too. So my job as a CENTCOM commander is to protect them as well if we get into this. And it's a monumental task in terms of what you would need in terms of defense, offense if you need it, and then maintaining your ability to achieve success in the other tasks that I mentioned.
General, I'm sorry you can't be more candid with us.
Marines don't understand candor.
Ambassador, let's pick up on the issue of red lines. This summer, red lines is very important when Benjamin Netanyahu came in, but we as Americans think about red lines all the time. What should be the red line? And I know from reading this report, I am sure that you talked about that in terms of the nuclear program, because you're laying out the costs and benefits of a military strike, and that has to be about red lines. How is the group thinking about red lines? How should we be thinking about red lines?
Well, let me say first that no president worth his salt is going to telegraph in advance precisely what he is going to do when. And the president has to protect his capacity. Now, this president, as I hear him, has said he does not admit of a situation in which Iran can become a nuclear weapons power, and that all options are on the table. There has also been pretty unambiguously a statement that says if Iran should decide to go, that will be a message, if I could put it that way, to the United States that the options have to become active. I want to be careful about this. And I think that that's out there and very clear. So Iran cannot be under any misimpression. What I have to say, however, is that I believe, and I think this, and I'll be like Tony, and I'll be straightforward here, this has been part of the debate with Israel. This is now clear, in my view, that following the Israeli Prime Minister's speech in New York in September, and even more, the president's approach to this, whether in fact the New York Times story on Monday was true or not, or whatever denial is there, there is a negotiating option. The president has said so, and in fact the president has combined sanctions and negotiation as a pretty clear option. Secondly, our group agreed, and I cannot imagine a president who would in fact not exhaust every opportunity to solve this problem short of having to use military force. And that judgment, of course, has to be made on the basis of where he thinks things go. Now, we have said very clearly in the report, we believe that, one, there is a very clear indication that we will have, nothing is perfect, but there is a very clear indication that we will have that if Iran decides to go, we could expect 3 or 4 things to happen. One, that the IAEA, which is inspecting all of the critical elements of their program, including continuously their enrichment program, will have to be thrown out because it also watches all of the enriched material that they have made. Secondly, they probably would have to withdraw from the NPT. We're not certain. Thirdly, and most importantly, and we would see this, or we would see the absence of the IAEA, which would be a telltale, that they will have to begin enriching above the levels in which they are currently enriching, moving toward weapons-grade material. So that is very important, and I think that that is a clear indication. We were asked, Lester, you don't mind if I bring you into this conversation a little bit. We were asked, Jim and I, by Lester before we came up here, do we have high confidence that there is no completely black Iranian program churning out material now of weapons-grade variety? And Jim and I said, look, we don't have 100% certainty of anything, but we have very high certainty, and so does the U.S. intelligence community, for a lot of reasons which we can go into in detail with you, that it is highly unlikely they have such a program, in part because they've had such a struggle making their open or semi-open, inspected, monitored program work. So those 2 things I would call very important indicators and may well be a part of the basis for the judgment that Jim gave you of General Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence and the head of the U.S. intelligence community. So I believe, in answer to your question, we have clear ideas that a weapon is a red line. The question, however, is not an absolute indication of when military force can be used. And I have a very clear idea, and I think I'm joined by others, that one wants to exhaust the other opportunities, before having to do so. But we put our report on the table so you can make your own judgments about the cost and benefits of a military action against Iran. And indeed, we even parsed it to the point where we said we believe there would be much more acceptability worldwide of that action if there was a clear indication that Iran had decided to make a nuclear weapon. Now, I have to tell you that the benefits include, on the United States side, being able, in effect, to create a 4-year hiatus in the program. We believe Israel acting alone could achieve up to a 2-year hiatus, in part because their military capabilities are not as extensive as ours, and some of the equipment that we can deliver against targets is heavier and more difficult for them. They don't have the capacity to do that. We also believe that, as Jim and Tony have said, there are horrendous costs for this, in direct reaction by Iran against Israel and the United States, against indirect action through surrogates, against economic consequences to a fragile world economy still trying to recover, which undoubtedly, in my view, would be set back by a huge spike in energy prices as a result of some kind of action. There would be, in my view, depending on the circumstances, a serious reaction against the United States worldwide if the attack were unprovoked, if we couldn't make it clear that, in fact, Iran had decided to go for a nuclear weapon. I don't know whether, in fact, we would get the Russians and the Chinese to support us in the Security Council, but the circumstances there would be a lot better if we could just demonstrate very clearly what's been happening, because over the years, the Russians and the Chinese have gradually but inexorably moved in our directions. The Chinese do not like new high energy prices. And the Russians share, I believe, a very strong view with us that a proliferation in the Middle East of nuclear weapons cannot be construed in any way that is seriously in their interest, despite the fact that they may want to play pre-electoral and post-electoral games in Russia with the U.S. account. Let me stop there. That was more than you wanted to hear,
No,
but I had to get it all
there's a
out.
perfect segue, Jim, and I'm coming to you because Tom mentioned kind of the if they decide to go, and the report spends a lot of time laying out very clearly the different timelines of the 1 month versus 6 months versus 12 months, the enrichment versus weaponization. This would be a great time for you to follow on.
Let me do follow on that, but I'm tempted. I want to say one thing about this issue of red lines, right? Because the red lines is sort of was in the political space a dominant issue for a while. And what I want to suggest to you is that that's a second order question. And I think one of the reasons why so many retired military officers and 3 national security advisors to 4 presidents, Republican and Democratic, endorsed the report is because there's a frustration echoed in Tony's comments where we say, well, if we have a red line, we'll attack them. If X, then Y. No one's talked about what the objective is. I mean, this is what the military people were saying to the non-proliferation person here. First, what would be the objective of military action? And then you decide later, okay, if we're going to do it, we'll set up a red line, and then we'll do this, and there are tactical issues. But the first question is the conversation that the country has, what would be the objective of the use of force? Now, is it to eliminate the program? If you're going to eliminate the program, as I said before, you can't bomb the knowledge out of their heads. So we're looking more like an Iraq thing with boots on the ground and a major war, and where you're changing the regime and trying to persuade the succeeding regime not to go down that nuclear path. That would be eliminating the program. So if
Could I just make one point here?
Sure.
Our report estimates that if you like that option, it will only cost more than Iraq and Afghanistan combined.
So, and I think people say, oh, if they cross the red line, we'll attack them. Well, what is it that you hope to achieve with that, and at what cost? And that's why, Tom mentioned the downsides. There are benefits here too, right? An attack against Iran would delay the program. It might send a reassuring message to our allies in the region. It might deter other proliferators elsewhere in the globe. So there are costs and there are benefits, but they have to be weighted against what you hope to achieve. And we haven't had a conversation about what we hope to achieve. That's the core point. So, if we think we can go and we can delay it for 4 years, I think that's a benefit. That's awesome. And then the question is, what do you do after that? Do you go in again? Do you have perpetual wars in the Middle East every 4 years? Or do you hope that maybe the strike, gins up something internally in Iran and they change, or maybe they hunker down and get, But that's the conversation you need to have with yourself and with fellow citizens about how does this work.
And so Jim, on that though, I think that it's really picking up on that. How do we understand what it means if Iran decides to go? What is that? So
Yes, and to answer your question, so yes, I wander off on occasion. Let me warn you. Luckily, he's worse than I am, and so you'll never even notice when I do it.
You're an academic, you're allowed to.
I'm professionally entitled to do that. I've trained for that. And again, in trying to think through the problem and parse it out, we think they're going for the bomb, they build the bomb, bang, they're a nuclear weapon state. Well, that's not quite the way it works. And it depends on what you think their objective is. Again, this objective stuff is sort of important. Do they want a militarily reliable, useful weapon that their military feels that they can use if called upon to do so? That's a higher level of standard than most people think about it. So first, you enrich the uranium, you kick out all the inspectors, you enrich the uranium, you enrich it up to 90%. Nothing happens. If you're Iran, you hope nothing happens in between those 2 points. And then after you've enriched the uranium, you manufacture. I think in the bomb process, there are two things that are super hard. One is that initial enrichment, going from no enrichment to 2, 3, 5%. That's really hard, and they've done that. The other hard thing is, well, once you have enriched the uranium and you've manufactured a crude device, not a weapon, but a device, and then you test it, and if you're lucky, the test works, or it fails in a way that allows you to make it work, but you got to do that. Then you test it, then you fashion a crude device, and then this whole process, the hardest thing is to miniaturize a crude warhead and put it on a reliable missile. I mean, the last thing you want to do if you're country X is press a button, have the missile go up, have the bomb go off early, have the missile fail and crash. I mean, you have to have high confidence, right? High confidence. There's only one country in the world that ever tested a live nuclear weapon over its own territory. That was China, where they sent a nuclear missile in the 60s from one end of China to the other. What were they thinking? Wow. But that was Mao and the Cultural Revolution. It was a really nasty time, but we don't have time to get into that. So anyway, you've got to reprocess, you've got to enrich the uranium, you've got to a point where you can manufacture a weapon, you've got to test the weapon, and then you've got to go from having a device to having something that a government, a president, a general would be confident in actually contemplating use of. And that takes time. So I follow Secretary of Defense's estimate, and it's not just his, that from the moment they decide, assuming they can kick out all the inspectors and no one reacts, or they find a secret store of HEU or something, it's going to take them a year plus to go from yes right now to yes we have. So a year and a half.
Thank you. HEU, highly enriched uranium.
And what size do you want your stockpile? I mean, really, you're going to build one weapon? What country builds one weapon? So again, it depends on what their objectives are. Sorry.
So no, absolutely. General, I'm running out of time, and there's so many questions
because of
to
us.
ask.
Yes.
No, well, it's an important subject. I could talk to each of you for a very long time. But General, I do want to get in at this point. I think you're well positioned to answer it. Is we've heard Ehud Barak talk about Israel's zone of immunity, that there will become a time where they really can't react anymore, and that's obviously different for the United States. So as a military planner, we have to think about what our allies in the region are doing and how we can back them up, or probably more importantly, extend that zone for them, make that time horizon longer. how do you think about planning in this, where Israel's calculations, by necessity, given where they're located, is different than ours? How do we think of planning for that? How should we think of planning for that?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to think in terms of cooperative defenses in the region, air and missile defense and other things. And obviously we have the strongest relationship with Israel. We have other relationships in the region that are just as worried, just as vulnerable in their eyes on the other side of the Gulf, that have been with us for a while and provided bases and support and even paid for our presence in the region over a long period of time. So it's critically important that whatever we do, that protection is considered in this calculation. Let me just follow up on something Jim said, because it's very important, about a military person asking, what do you want me to do? Because I think in our minds, we think about a strike on potential nuclear facilities. But we got to do something about their air defense system. Are we going to do something about their missile system, just in case? Are we going to take out their Navy? Are we going to bomb their intelligence headquarters? Or are we going to let those go and just hope and pray and assume they're not going to counterattack? So these would be my questions. And then what? So you do it. And now you have a lingering residual capability, even if they don't react right away. So how long do I have to be there on alert? What happens down the road? Is regime removal in this calculation? Even though you may say no in the beginning, is there something they could do? They could say it was so unacceptable that they have to go. Ahmadinejad has to go, and Khamenei has to go, along with Assad and Gaddafi and everybody else that has to go out in the region. So, in my mind, the and then what questions are critically important here. And they go to your point about the region, because our allies are going to be asking us this. Don't leave us a mess in the end. It's about stability and it's about growth. It's about the changes that everyone expects in this region, but we get set back if there's damage done and then there's no follow-up. And are we going to rebuild another nation? Are we going to stay out there in greater military force than we have now, when it's critically important that we understand how much military force we can afford?
So I know your answer to this will be yes, because you're a Marine, so you will say you can do it. But there's an amount of time that you need, that the U.S. military needs to effectively respond to the knowledge that Iran has now moved towards a nuclear weapon?
Not a lot of time. They can respond pretty quickly, but I want to get to the point. The first response is not the issue. It's what comes after that, and the enduring chronic problems that could be created, what it could lead to. That's why I say we can't talk in terms of military action, military strike. We have to plan as if we're going to be involved in an enduring conflict out there, and we're not sure which form it could take. We have to plan against worst case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I assume there's questions. Otherwise, I would continue for a long time. So bear with me. I'm going to try to get them all in. I'll take the gentleman in the red shirt right there. And please introduce yourself to our speakers. And please, because there's so many questions, make sure there's a question mark at the end of whatever you say.
Max Overholt. Question, given the way how thinly our military has been spread as a consequence of Iraq and Afghanistan, should we end up taking action should we end up taking military action in Iran, what could some of those consequences result in?
Thank you. General, I'm going to pass that to you.
Well, obviously, our military has been stretched pretty thin, not just in terms of the wear and tear on our equipment, our capabilities, obviously our troops and the constant deployment. My son's a Marine. He's done 6 deployments, Iraq and Afghanistan. And so if we take an action like this, again, we can't assume it's a one-strike action. It may mean that we have a situation now that further destabilizes the region and requires the presence of greater force in the region in order to maintain stability. And so what does that mean? How are we going to support those rotations? You heard in the debate about shrinking ships and shrinking units and manpower cuts. So to sustain another major commitment over a long period of time would be a great strain on our military as it works now. In the aftermath of Iraq and particularly Afghanistan, which has 2 more years to play out at this moment.
Thank you. Roy Gilad, Consul General from Israel.
Thank you. Gentlemen, is it possible that all this discussion about red lines is reflecting a growing feeling in Israel that Iran is basically manipulating the international community? After all, I think the P5+1 is engaged with Iran for nearly 10 years, and it's enough to take the reports of the IAEA and to see that the centrifuges have not stopped. At the beginning, we counted low enriched uranium. Now we are for 3.5%, now for 20%. It seems as if the international effort is not bearing much fruits. And if I may add to what Lester asked you, Tom, and you answered about a possibility of something that is happening clandestine, I'm not sure that the answer is so strong, bearing in mind that there were things that were not discovered, like the site in Parachin, Purdue, that have been revealed by Iran only at the eve of when the international community was about to reveal it. So I'm not sure we can really say that we know everything that is happening in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, Tom, to that point, do we keep changing the benchmarks of when we should be very concerned, and how do we know what we don't know?
Yeah, let me say that your question is precisely the reason why I think we need to engage in an intensive negotiation. Now, let me be frank. We're in an election period. There isn't going to be a negotiation until the election is over. And I'll let you figure out all the reasons why that's true. That's not my job to comment on American elections. But I do have to tell you very frankly that we've been through a period where first the U.S. didn't attend negotiations. Then it started to attend negotiations, but we had a peculiar form of negotiation. We met once a year and we spent the whole year negotiating the next meeting. And at each meeting, one side would put something on the table and the other side would reject it. And we go back and negotiate the next meeting. The beginning of this year, I have to tell you, we had 3 successive meetings. We started a process. It didn't produce a great deal. We had experts meetings, and let's hope that we'll begin again. But I have to tell you, too, very frankly, that each side has been in a horse for a rabbit mode. You know what that is? I want your horse, and I'll give you my rabbit.
Oh, yeah.
That's an old Texas expression for fruitful negotiations. Lester knows what that's all about. In any event, each side has been in a horse for a rabbit mode. So to my judgment, we have to get a little closer in terms of where we can go. Now, a principal question, and my good friend, the Israeli Consul General, raised this indirectly when he said the centrifuges have been spinning. A principal question will be whether we can have a fruitful negotiation about no enrichment in Iran. And we've been trying 10 years for that. And he's right. And I don't believe we can. But I do believe, and Jim and I joined with another individual in an article 4 years ago in which we said some enrichment can be tolerated if a couple of things happen. One of those is perhaps you can get multinational control of the enrichment. Secondly, even more importantly in my view, is perhaps the International Inspection Agency can be given increased inspection rights to ensure that between a civil program and the military program, we have even more capacity to determine whether they're going to cross the red line clandestinely, whether they're doing things clandestinely, and so on. And I think there's plenty of scope for that. So my view is a negotiation which begins to engage in that area is important. Finally, I have to say, I've watched this for a long period of time. I don't think, given the level of mistrust and misunderstanding, that a negotiation can proceed without the U.S. and Iran speaking directly together. I don't think a negotiation can proceed if somebody comes in with a complicated and complex grand bargain. I think we have to start with something really important, and that's getting at the 20% enriched material, because that's the closest we have to material they can upgrade rapidly. And I think we have to get something there that can, in effect, begin the process of turning back what I would call the spearhead of the dangerous part of the Iranian effort. That has to help us build some trust. Their view is we want regime change. Our view is they're running headlong for a bomb. And that's why, in fact, the negotiation process has to have a serious go. And I have to tell you, I don't think it's had a serious go despite the 10 years of dancing.
Did you want to jump in on this, Jim?
No, I think
okay. Let's
you
go
probably
back.
want to get more questions
So,
in.
right on the end there. Yeah, the blue blazer. Thank you.
I'd like to back up for a second. And there was an article in the Foreign Affairs magazine that said that it would be better if Iran had a nuclear weapon as a balancing force in the Middle East. I haven't heard any discussion of that issue.
Well, I mean, I think we all love preemptive capitulation. It's an easy way to solve the problem, but it doesn't deal with the consequences. And we've talked about the consequences. We don't have to rehash that. Jim?
Yeah, just I mean, that has a certain history to it. Ken Waltz, famous academic, international
Steve
relations. No, Ken Waltz.
No.
Was it Ken Walsh?
Yeah. You know, wrote More May Be Better and
Yeah.
argued that he sort of believes in the religion of deterrence, that if every state had nuclear weapons, then war would end. And it's an argument that can be made. And, you know, in all honesty, you know, I'm fundamentally against the spread of nuclear weapons. That's my core thing. But as you know, as a scholar, it has to be said, like everything else in life, you can imagine situations in which it would yield benefits, just like our paper talks about costs and benefits. You can imagine a situation in which adversaries have nuclear weapons, and it has positive effects. The question is, how long do they last, and will they last forever? That's the part I worry about, is the forever part. But, you know, there are arguments to be made there, but I don't think anyone takes that notion, as provocative and fun as it may be, intellectually, they take it very seriously.
Kareem Pakravan right here.
My question has to do with considering consequence of a military attack on the Iranian people. There are reports that if there are military attacks on nuclear facilities, there will be a tremendous amount of radioactive material that will be released. And in general, even if that doesn't happen, you're going to have fairly massive casualties on the Iranian side. And the other political consequence is you're going to lose the friendship of the people who are generally pro-American. So is that part of the equation and a discussion too?
I'll take just a small piece about the nuclear,
Talk about the nuclear.
and
I'll
then
talk about
leave the
people.
rest, yeah, the political effects. You know, I think there's some debate about this. I think the effects tend to be overestimated. I think more people, it's like a dirty bomb. More people are going to be killed by the bomb than their exposure to radioactivity. Remember, other than Bushehr, we're not talking about active plants, you know, nuclear plants in which there are nuclear reactions. We're talking about low enriched uranium that's sitting in barrels, you know, in an underground facility. So I think the radiological effects would probably be modest, but you'll kill a lot of people, right? I mean, this is, Tony's point is that, you know, once you start down that path, well, we got to take out their air defenses so our airplanes don't get hurt, right, hit when they go in. And we might want to take out some of their retaliatory capability so they can't strike back after the effect. And we might, you know, you start doing all the things you want to do to make it as safe as possible for your armed forces, and you end up, that list of things you're doing grows and grows, and eventually civilians will be impacted by that. But so I guess in summary, there are probably some radiological risks. I don't see anyone attacking and blowing up Bushehr. I don't think that's on anyone's target list, and it's far removed, it's on the coast, and I don't think anyone would attack it, a nuclear power plant. So I think you might have some environmental issues, but in the main, the real health consequences are going to come from guns and bullets and bombs, not from relatively low radioactive materials.
Let me talk a little bit about popular reaction. We struggled with this. There are people who will say Iran is a country that is in pre-revolution waiting to happen, that the demonstrations that took place after the election of June 12th, 2009, where large numbers of Iranians went on the street, is an indication of the ferment. You made the point, and as a tourist in 2004, I experienced the same thing. Lots of friendliness from Iranian people on the street toward Americans. My own feeling is shaped in a little different way. I believe that if attacked, a country will rally to its people, to its leadership, regardless of what they think. That it was very clear in the 8-year war in which Iraq attacked Iran that the popular will and indeed the sacrifice of Iranians in that war was legendary. My own view is the one that I believe was inherent in your question, if not explicit, that we do run a very serious risk of antagonizing a people and having them rally around their government. And if people harbor interests in regime change, it may not be the best thing that one could do to produce that result. I myself have serious doubts that the United States is in a position to produce regime change in Iran. The people who can produce regime change in Iran are Iranians. And unfortunately, up until now, the administration in Iran, the regime in Iran, has practiced an iron-fisted policy, using many instruments to suppress that. I don't know in the long run whether that is going to mean that the change people will gather momentum or not. We see it in different ways in different places. But our experience in installing new regimes has been a fairly lamentable part of an undistinguished chapter in American history, and I believe all of my reservations in that are widely shared.
General, can you imagine a situation where we respond militarily and don't move to regime change? Well, I'll just leave the question at that.
Well, I'm more concerned about the objective not being regime change, more limited, which I think is the most probable, and then finding yourself in a situation where you have no recourse but to go to regime change because of some retaliation or something that occurs. And then you find yourself in a situation, how do you affect regime change? And as usually happens, you come to the military to do it. And when I show you that plan, the sticker shock in Washington will be monumental.
Rachel, I was engaged at the UN in a conflict which was not trivial, in which we specifically eschewed the option of regime change, and that was to roll back the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1991. And there were people who disagree. I mean, some think that one of the impetuses, if that's the right word, for the 2002-3 action against Iraq was because we didn't do that. But my own feeling was it was exactly the right decision. Almost everyone that I knew who looked at that decision foresaw what might happen in 2003 and decided that was a very bad decision to take us beyond what was the mandate, which was to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait.
Because the need to plan for regime change, and maybe appropriately so, does handcuff to some extent the policymakers. If you're in a very difficult position and you can only go to regime change, and the sticker shock is, how you've been in these policy positions, how do you think about that? I mean, are there ways, like you experienced, to surgical strike isn't the right way, but to use the kind of military option in a way that there's a high likelihood that you don't have to go to regime change. I'm thinking about Madeleine Albright, right, and her concerns that, so what's the military for, and that was a very shocking statement, but the need to think about, the need to plan for that kind of comprehensive regime change can hamstring decisions.
Well, you asked the wrong guy. I don't think military force is a viable, useful, shortcut substitute for diplomacy.
I can make an argument. Let me make an argument for the other side. There's some people who would suggest that Israel took preventive action against Iraq's nuclear program in 1981 and against Syria's program. And if you follow the Israeli press, you'll see that there are arguments that say this was successful and that we can do that again in...
Israel never admitted the one in Syria.
Yeah. Israel doesn't admit a lot of things we assume. It's okay.
You're just gonna, that's just my wild guess.
But that's not regime change. It's the change in a type of regime.
Exactly, exactly. But this gets to the point of, could you have a smaller scale preventive action that doesn't go all the way down that path?
Sure.
I will say though, just very quickly, those get cited as successes. There's a whole body of scholarship that would suggest that that limited attack on Osirak then persuaded Saddam Hussein to make his nuclear weapons program job one. That he released nuclear engineers and scientists out of prison, that prior to the Osirak attack, there were, you know, it was a program, it was a special weapons program. There were lots of exotic special weapons programs. They weren't very well managed. Then he gets whacked, and then he says, okay, fine, we're going to get serious about this. And then there's a debate about whether that, you know, whether buying enough time was good. But there are some, even with limited strikes that look good, they can work, and they can also produce the very thing you're seeking to avoid. You can get a bomb decision where it becomes top priority.
One quick point on regime change and using the military to do that. There's an assumption in there that the regime change goes smoothly. If it doesn't, and I've seen this movie too many times.
We have to.
And if it doesn't, and the military inherits the, you know, an unstable environment, then the military gets stuck with trying to reconstruct it in some way. And, you know, that's been our pattern. And I think that's one thing I think the military is going to be very cautious about if they're going to be involved in this in some way. Is this MacArthur in Japan or Allen in Kabul? Or, you know, what is the outcome?
Richard for right here.
Thank you. I think that we're all assuming that the military option means bombing and carnage. But the thing that the discussion that's going on now is that the biggest threat in the 21st century is really cyber warfare. So I'm wondering if it's possible that while all of this other discussion that we're having tonight is going on, that there is perhaps a program that we don't know about, and maybe you can't talk about, to develop Stuxnet on steroids, so that when they do get the bomb and they push the button, nothing happens.
Terrific question. That's a terrific question. How do we think, I mean, those are the other kinds of options that didn't come up directly. How do we think about cyber responses? Is that the kind of right way to be thinking about this?
Well, it's you know, it's a way. Remember, he gets a vote in this too. Are we going to get what is the definition of cyber war? Is it an act of war? Do I retaliate against a cyber attack with military kinetic force? I mean, we're assuming we can do all this damage and this preventative work in use of cyberspace. We're not assuming that the Persians are stupid, I hope. And if that happens, they just shut down Aramco in Saudi Arabia. So are we going to now define the conflict as cyberspace? And to what degree will we accept suffering from cyber attacks before we choose another method of attacking? I mean, those would be my questions. It's wonderful to think about this as sanitary and not affecting us, but there are things that can be done through cyber attacks that will cost lives and affect people and our own security and our interests.
You know, I think it's a possibility. Certainly, my sense of it is that the military is putting more emphasis on that in terms of the sort of research it's funding, and as a priority, cyber and Asia are basically what I hear DoD talking a lot about. We've had two runs at this, right? We had Stuxnet and we had the follow-up one that have at least been reported on. If you read the IAEA reports, which are a ton of fun, which I do every 3 months, you know, it only seemed, there was a lot of crowing around Stuxnet, and then it seemed like there were only modest effects. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be something that we don't know about in the future that would be useful, but I mean, I think we're looking at a period of, you know, the next year or so where we really need to be serious about whether, you know, negotiation is going to happen or it's not going to happen, or there'll be unexpected external shocks. Someone's going to screws up and does something they shouldn't have done, or they do something that gets misperceived, and there's a mistake. So it may be that cyber will be useful, but I'm not sure the time frames match up right now. I think we're talking about something that has to be addressed in a more in a shorter time frame than that particular capability. But I don't know anything about it. But that's just my guess.
Can I say something,
Yes,
Rachel?
please.
I think, listen to Tony Zinni. My concern is that we have no monopoly. We spend a lot of time and money on offensive cyber. I'm not sure we spend enough time and money on defensive cyber. If cyber has a shutdown capability, and Aramco is not a trivial 2-bit corporation. It's 12 million barrels of oil potential a day and maybe running at 8 or 9. What happens if we get into an environment if I could put it this way, where people start throwing cyber around loosely. What happens to your power, your lights? What happens to your utility base? What happens to your society? Think about it, because when we approached in 1950s and 60s the potential for weapons of mass destruction, particularly nuclear, to cause that same kind of havoc, we went into a posture that had two elements to it: deterrence, defense, and offensive capability, and we started to make international agreements about the size, the scope, and the capacity. And I think it's not too early to begin to think about that particular question. And we've kind of fenced that out. Now, maybe it's not jihadi enough for us to be thinking along those lines. But I think it is important because it has a potential to affect our society in ways that are serious here in the homeland. And those are the things that we're concerned about with respect to terrorism. But we ought to begin to look at this particular set of activities and make judgments about it. I'm not trying to ring an alarm bell, and I'm not trying to say it's about to happen. It may never happen. But I do think it's something that we need to begin to talk to people about. Our friends in China, who seem to practice this fairly loosely. The Russians have a potential. Other people have potential. As Tony says, they're not stupid.
The gentleman, you've been waiting right there. Yeah, right there.
First of all, gentlemen, congratulations. Thank you for a very good, logically structured discussion. I have a question, and I'm wondering why nobody in the media or anybody has talked about one subject, whether one way or the other, whether it's feasible or not, that if Iran really wanted a nuclear weapon, aren't there enough bad boys in the neighborhood that they could buy it from? Pakistan, North Korea, God knows how many are missing in the Soviets. Nobody's talking, at least say, no, it can't be done, but talk about it.
I'd like you just to hold. I think is there a question right there? Oh, no, with all these questions, I thought the microphone was right there. So go ahead.
Let me just talk about that very briefly. I mean, there have been rumors, for example, about potential Pakistani-Saudi Arabia cooperation in the transfer of weapons, but that's always just sort of written about, and no one knows what's really going on with that. There has been some you get missile cooperation much more easily between North Korea and Iran, North Korea and others. And of course, we talk about Iran as a potential nuclear threat, and it should be taken seriously. What's the most dangerous nuclear weapons country in the world? In my ranking of the top 5, it's Pakistan, 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 and Pakistan. And that's because A.Q. Khan went out there, like shopping, like Walmart, and that's how Iran got its original bomb design and got some of the early centrifuge technology. Typically, states don't like to transfer the jewels of the realm to another state because they don't want to see that turned around back on them. Presumably, A.Q. Khan had the imprimatur of the government, and some of those state-to-state transfers, Pakistan to North Korea, were clearly approved by the governments involved. But no one has really crossed that line of, here it is, the whole package, and it's yours. And even if I got one, I'd still want to test it. If someone sold me one, I'd want to test that proposition, metaphorically and otherwise. But it hasn't happened so far in the nuclear age, and you can sort of understand why you would be careful about that, because you don't want it turned around on you. But you would have thought that would have precluded A.Q. Khan, too. So I think there's some ambiguity there.
Let me just make 2 points. Jim is entirely right. The whole history of this is that the people who get the weapon want nobody else to have one, except A.Q. Khan.
Right.
And he was a bit of an aberration. Secondly, the other question is they find it very hard to figure out what they really are going to use it for.
Dina, I see you have a question right back there. Yeah, go ahead. Nope, back there.
The poor back of the room deserves a question.
Yeah.
I feel your pain.
I see a hand back there, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your great talk. I have kind of an overview question. You talked a lot about strategy and objective. I'm wondering if one of the goals of United States foreign policy is for a nuclear-free Middle East, and that includes Israel.
It's a very interesting question. We voted in the Security Council for a meeting to be held this year It's likely to be held next month. And our poor friends in Finland were selected by the Secretary General of the United Nations to prepare it, and they have been busily engaged in doing so. I don't know yet who will come. There is no question at all that the Israeli Consul General can speak best for Israel about Israeli policy. But my sense is that Israel has traditionally believed that the threats to it from the Middle East need to be resolved through a negotiating process before it can address the question. On the other hand, our friends in Iran, who purportedly don't have it, and Egypt and other places have been leading the charge to have such a zone. My own feeling is that it is unlikely to appear full-blown in December coming out of this meeting. That would be a hope beyond all reality. But one could begin to think about things that might be done that could help prepare the way. One, of course, is to keep Iran out of the nuclear weapons business. Other kinds of things might obviously include the Arab countries who 2 or 3 years ago all suddenly wanted to have giant civilian power programs to make sure, in fact, that we do everything possible to assure them that their security is something that we share an interest in on the one hand, and on the other hand, that we work with them to ensure that their nuclear power programs do not present the kind of danger we at least feel there's some reason to be concerned about in Iran.
Gentlemen, we're coming to the end of our time. I want to give each of you a chance to just comment on, I'm sure there's a lot of important things that I and we haven't touched on. So I might start, General, is there anything that you want to make sure that we talk about or leave with? And then I'll come down the
No, I think I would just go very briefly to Tom's initial point about we made no recommendations. We're not taking a position here. We just want everybody's eyes to be wide open. Whatever course we decide to take, whatever red lines are there, the enforcement is going to be something that isn't going to be easy. And I think that's the point of what we're trying to get across.
Jim?
Sadly, he just stole my line, what I was going to say. So I will say this. I would say that if you listen to the public discussion and debate about Iran, it's basically one in which people are saying Iran is rushing to the bomb, determined to get the bomb, may already have the bomb, and it's that it's all sort of assumed to that. And I think we really need to pull back and focus on what our top intelligence officers testified to in public at high confidence, which is they haven't made that decision. Now, they have a capability, and they're beavering away at improving their capability, and there are a lot of things that are suspicious about the program. I carry no brief for the Iranians. And everyone who negotiates with them and just pulls out their hair and hates them afterwards. There's this process that it's pretty funny, actually, but I'll describe it later, or at some other point. But I think the core thing is they have yet to make a decision. And that presents an opportunity for moving this in a different direction. So that's such a simple point, but I really don't hear anyone other than the Director of National Intelligence saying this out loud. You would never hear it in any political debate. So I think we need to ground ourselves back in the facts and then realize they haven't made a decision, and then the question is, what is our objective and how are we going to achieve our objective?
And I agree with both what Tony and Jim have said, and I would go back to a point I made in the middle of the discussion that I think if you read this report, you will find it interesting to look at our next reports, because we're going to look at sanctions, and then perhaps we've written extensively about negotiating alternatives. I hope that we do our best to see, in fact, whether we can quickly run out the other options so that at the end, when we have to use when we have to use force, and I'm not against that, at the end of the day, if that's what we have to do, we have done everything we can to make sure, in fact, that we understand what it is, we understand its limits and its possibilities very clearly, and we have done everything we can through the other alternatives, which I fully support now, before we get there.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree with me that we are very lucky to have people of the caliber of those on stage thinking about this on our behalf and coming to hear our thoughts and responses. And it is an open invitation when you issue your next set of reports, which you've promised us in this paper, to come back and discuss it with us. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our panelists.